Hello everybody, welcome back to Allan Wall's Photography. This is Allan bringing you Chapter 2 of My Best Practices. This picks up right where Chapter 1 left off, and Chapter 1 and Chapter 3 are already available if you want to watch those while you're here. In Chapter 1, we concentrated on macro photography out in the field, and in Chapters 2 and 3, we're going to take it back into the studio. Thank you, as always, to the supporters of Allan Wall's Photography for making these videos possible. Let's get to it. Well, I told you that was a pretty park, and I told you it was a gorgeous day. I feel vindicated. There's two things that occurred to me on the way back that I didn't bring up that I should have brought up. The first is the tripod thing. If you're going to be using natural light as your primary plan for a day, by all means take a tripod. It can come in handy, and you may well end up needing it if you start having to shoot at longer shutter speeds. If you're shooting flash, don't waste your time with a tripod. You'll lug it around, it'll never do you any good. And the second thing was the use of ring flash. Now, a lot of people have a thing about ring flash reflections in insects' eyes. Now, I happen to like them. I also like them in human eyes. I love the ring light look as a catch light in a portrait, but I am absolutely fine with seeing ring lights in bugs' eyes too. If, however, you're not, then don't mess with a ring flash, because you cannot diffuse away the shape of that ring. You'll have a diffused reflection of a ring light if you put diffusion on it. I do use diffusion just to try to soften it a little bit, but just bear that in mind. If you buy a ring light thinking that there'll be some way for you to get rid of the ring reflections, there isn't, and you won't, so don't bother. All right, so we're back in the studio. We have a fair amount to cover, and I'm going to try to go through this as systematically as I possibly can. What is the difference between shooting indoors and shooting outdoors? Well, when we're outdoors, we are either working with the light that's available, or we are trying to overcome some problem or augment the light that's present. For example, we're using a flash as a fill light to fill some of the shadows, or we're using a continuous light late in the day or early in the morning to actually primarily light our subject, but we're still working with natural light. So it's always a blend of natural light and the stuff we bring with us. In the studio, it's not. In the studio, if you're doing it right, it's just your lighting. And that is the main and key difference, is you have total control when you're in the studio. In fact, if you don't have total control, it means you haven't got control of your ambient light, and you're struggling with the found light in your studio. And that should never happen, but we'll get to that in a minute. So when we're in the studio, we are controlling every aspect of the light, the direction, the intensity, the color, where the shadows fall. Everything is in our control, which is both good if you want to take great pictures, and bad if you're just learning and thought it would be easy. Because it's not easy. Now, the first thing about shooting indoors or shooting in a studio that I think is critical is to find a workspace for you to work in. That's why it's called a workspace. A place that is comfortable and accessible, meaning you can move around in your workspace and you can get to the various parts of the space that you're going to need to without having to climb over boxes or bodies or whatever you keep in your workspace. Well lit, where you can control the ambient light. If you can make it permanent, that's even better, meaning you don't have to break it down when your husband needs to do the ironing. The reason I think all of this is so important is because it's like learning a musical instrument. If you decide you want to play the guitar and you buy the cheapest guitar you can find, you're not going to learn how to play the guitar because you're not going to want to pick the thing up. You're going to want to wait for your fingertips to stop bleeding before the next time you play it. If you want to learn how to play the guitar, you want to play something that looks and feels and sounds nice. That'll make you play more guitar. It'll make it a pleasure to pick it up and practice. It is no different in your macro studio. Having a space that's comfortable, accessible, practical, and well lit will make you more eager to get down there or up there or wherever it is to work. If it's a jumbled mess with live electrical wires everywhere and you just won't use it, you won't do it. Trust me, it's true. There is a temptation when you start, if you're just getting going with this, that you don't want to mess around having to build stuff or buy stuff. You just want the bare essentials so that you can see if you like it. And I understand that. But let me tell you, if you have a camera and maybe a manual rail and you've got the thing mounted on a piece of wood and you're positioning your LEDs or your flashes around and about, you are just dramatically limiting what you're going to be able to do in that space. Because my theory is if you want to light macro excellently, you need to have almost 360-degree access to shine light at your subject. You'll understand more about this in a minute when we get into that, but putting your specimen on the table right there cuts half of your sphere of light out. Sure, you can put reflectors down there, but by having your specimen up in the air and having some kind of framework around you where you can suspend lights both from above and from below, it allows you to create lighting scenarios that would be impossible otherwise. So I recommend you build the most rudimentary of macro cages or lighting cages. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be any kind of frame. It could even be a piece of furniture. I've seen people do it with chairs. They weren't very good. I wouldn't recommend it. But I mean, you can do it if you can just get a couple of sturdy rods to mount flashes on. There's all kinds of ways. An upside down table. The issue with the cage is, though, you need to plan the cage around what you're going to be shooting and what lenses you're going to be using. If you plan to do all one-to-one macro photography using your macro lens, especially if it's a long lens like a 200, then you have to build a macro cage that gives you that depth, that allows you to have the camera far enough back to photograph your subjects. But if you're going to be using microscope objectives and you're going to be shooting teeny weeny little insects, then it's much more important that you are closer in so you can get that objective 5 millimeters, 10 millimeters, from your subject. So when you're thinking about your support structure, think about what you're going to be using it for. You know, if you want a structure that you can shoot a ladybird with and then shoot a pair of your wife's shoes to put on eBay, after asking her if that's okay, of course, then you need to plan around having that added distance because you're going to need a lot of distance with a macro lens to shoot a pair of shoes. So just think about what you're going to be using it for so you don't spend a whole day building something that is going to end up not being suited. I've got a whole series of videos on how to build one of these things. If you're interested, I'll put a link up here. One other thing about the macro cage that a lot of people overlook, and it causes a lot of problems. When you're setting the thing up, if you're using continuous lights like LED lights, or if your flashes are powered from the wall, consider how you manage your cables. You really want your cables out of the way. By the time you have 3 or 4 lights going on and a work light to work with, and you have cables running everywhere, It's a recipe for disaster. You're going to get unwanted shadows. You're going to knock things over. And if it's really bad, you could trip over them. So pay attention to how you manage your cables. So you're in the studio. You're thinking about doing some macro photography and you need light. So what are your options? Well, we've talked about every possible way of getting a photon from a device to your specimen in the last few weeks, but we can rule some of them out. I've given this a lot of thought, and there are only 4 legitimate reasons to use incandescent or tungsten halogen lights for your macro photography. The first is if you like to eat your insects after you've photographed them and want to save time and cook them while you're photographing them, incandescent's great. If you prefer the color of your gels when the gel's melted or on fire, that's a good reason. If you're really not challenged by macro photography and you want to try it with 3rd-degree burns all over your hands and your forehead and your neck, go for it. And the 4th reason is if your spouse is always telling you that you just really don't sweat enough and asking you to sweat more, incandescent's for you. For everybody else, forget about it. You're not going to use it. It's no good for macro. Too hot, too hard to control, too hard to modify, and pretty dangerous in the cellar. Something that I see people doing that I think is a big mistake, and that is using window light. Now, let me hasten to add that portraits shot using window light are some of my favorite shots. I love indoor, outdoor light, but not for macro. It doesn't work for macro. And the reason is the outdoor light is out of our control, so it doesn't fit the reason we're doing it. If you want to shoot in daylight macro, go shoot daylight macro. But if you want to be in the studio, don't try to use outdoor light. The sun is going to move, and it moves faster than you think. If you're doing a 200 shot stack and some of your light is coming from the sun, the quality and direction of that light is going to change during a 200 shot stack. And during the course of an afternoon, it'll change radically. All it takes is one big puffy cloud to go in front of it, and you've got a dark image. And also, as the sun moves through the sky, the shadows from your, what do you call those things on a window? Whatever they are, they leave shadows, and those shadows will move. So you'll start to see all kinds of things that are out of your control and you don't want. So avoid the temptation. If you want to do a nice boudoir shot using window light, knock yourself out. Knock yourself out. But if you're trying to shoot an insect, don't bother. You want to get rid of all the ambient light. You really do. You want to turn off your kitchen lights, and you want to close the curtains, and you want to have as much control as possible. We'll get into this when we talk about continuous light, but if you're using continuous light, that's an absolute must. Because as your shutter speeds get longer and longer, you start gathering more and more light you didn't even realize was there. With flash, you can get away with a little bit of light because your flash will overpower it, but not so with low power LED light, for example. Fluorescent light is probably not worth the effort. It's a very broad, directionless light. It's very soft and it can be quite nice. But if you're using anything but the expensive light bulbs, you're going to have color casts almost for certain, especially if you're trying to mix it with some other kind of lighting. If you're using affordable fluorescent tubes, you're going to have big chunks of the light spectrum missing. So colors on your insect aren't going to be accurate, and some of the colors might not even be represented. The expensive devices, on the other hand, weigh a ton. They come in metal cases and they have big ballasts in them. They're just not a good option for macro. mainly because of the issue with directing the light. If you're going to try it anyway, then maybe a compact fluorescent light, but it still needs to be a photography grade of compact fluorescent. They're also very soft, very diffuse. The cheap ones are missing big chunks of spectrum, even the daylight balanced ones. And remember, with fluorescent light, the metamerism we've talked about several times before, that just because a light has a color temperature of 5600 Kelvin does not mean it's full spectrum light. There are several ways you can combine light colors in order to get what looks like white light, but that does not mean it's full spectrum white light. You want full spectrum white light, you've got to get really, really good quality fluorescent tubes. Even the compact fluorescents are hard to modify, they're hard to aim, they're bulky, they are really, really breakable. Probably the biggest drawback of fluorescent light is flicker. The compact fluorescents do use an electronic ballast, and that helps with some of the flickering, but they still tend to flicker a little bit because the electronic ballast itself is running off wall current, which cycles at a 60 hertz frequency, or 50 in Europe. So the alternating current can induce a flicker even with an electronic ballast. One thing that is certainly true is the bigger your subjects get, the more options you have for lighting. You can get away with using LED panels and compact fluorescents when your subject is a bit bigger. But if you're talking about photographing tiny things, which certainly is the direction I tend to lean in, you're going to be much better off with either LEDs or flash. In fact, LEDs and flash are really the only choice we have. You can, under some circumstances, use a soft box with a studio flash to give you kind of a uniform brightness to the image. It's very hard to modify, very hard to control at short distance. So generally speaking, you're probably better off not bothering with it because it's just such a pain to use. And I would consider a very much advanced studio lighting technique to use strobes. If you have the best equipment out there that allows you to modify it down to workable beams of light, that's a different story. But if you've just got a couple of big soft boxes and a couple of studio strobes, I just leave them where they are and focus on using either LED or flash. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So if I was teaching you how to do macro photography, well, I suppose I am in a way. If you were my student and we were going through a regimented program of learning the best way to do studio macro, I would recommend that you start out with continuous lighting using LED. It teaches you an awful lot about light positioning, the inverse square law, managing reflections, balancing light sources, all while giving you what you see is what you get. Here are my best practices for purchasing LED lights. First of all, decide whether or not you want to use battery-operated devices like this Lume Cube or cabled devices like this. It's certainly nice to have access to continuous power so you don't have to worry about it. But let me tell you something about LEDs running off your house current. LEDs, as you know, are silicone-based semiconductors, and the bulb is a junction. It's an entirely electrical event that happens as electrons fill electron holes in the semiconductor and give off energy in the form of light. Now, what makes LEDs problematic when you plug them into the wall is that when they're on your house current, the very slightest changes in either the voltage or the current as would happen, for example, when a home appliance like a heat pump or the refrigerator, the motor in the refrigerator, when these things start up, they draw a tremendous amount of current at first until they get running, and then they don't need as much. But they cause a spike in the current draw, which is reflected in all the other outlets in your house. And what happens with LEDs is whatever is going on in your electrical environment, the LED is going to flicker. And sometimes it's terrible. Sometimes they dim to the point of going out and then come back on again as soon as the fridge is finished making a batch of ice or whatever it's doing. As we talked about in the LED episode, LEDs require an electronic driver to make them work. And there are some drivers that use what's called constant current. And constant current drivers will smooth out an awful lot of this flicker, and it can make them useful. If you're concerned about whether or not the LEDs you already own will work for your photography, do this little experiment. Set up your camera in your macro cage or whatever you're using and position your LED lights the way you want them just to photograph some little thing, anything you've got sitting around. It doesn't matter. Just get the light right for your exposure and then shoot 100 shots. Put it on a timer. You don't have to even stack them. Just shoot 100 images, one after the other. Then when you get them into your editor, into Lightroom or whatever, click through them really quickly, and you will be stunned by how the light varies from shot to shot. If that happens, you're working with an LED most likely plugged into the wall, and it is going to cause no end of problems in your stacking program. Now, Xerene Stacker has a setting that you can apply that will smooth out fluctuations in the light intensity a little bit. And your camera, if you have a high-end DSLR, sometimes the software in the camera can also smooth out those fluctuations. But if they go unchecked, they can cause significant problems for your stacking program, and they can result in weird anomalies in your photograph that you don't understand. All LED lamps are not created equal either. LED lights consist of a semiconductor junction, is what it's called, where current flows through the circuit and gives off energy in the form of light. Having one diode very much limits the light intensity because you can't just crank up the power on an LED. If you want more light, you have to have more LED junctions. Now, in this case, each of the junctions is in its own package. So these LEDs are separate, meaning each one of them has a junction at the bottom, has a plastic lens at the top. And the problem with this kind of light is it's just like using an LED panel. These individual lights are going to show up in reflective parts of your specimen. So this is the Janslow light from IKEA, which is popular with many macro photographers because it's got a long, bendy arm that really holds position well. The difference between this and the multi-lens version is this has one blob of phosphor with one lens at the front. So unlike the multi-lens version, this is going to give you more of a point light source. And that's one of the reasons that I like them and I use these. They are prone to flickering. There's just no two ways about it. I've tried all kinds of ways to limit the amount of flickering. And it's one of the reasons I don't use as much LED as other people do. There are more expensive ways to avoid the flickering. This is a good example. So when you're buying your LEDs, bear that in mind. If you can get something that's modeled more like this, you'll be happier with the results. Buy your LEDs as a set. Why is this important? LEDs have a bad habit of yellowing over time, and it's not really a function of how good the LED is, though certainly the really expensive ones don't seem to do it very much. but they do yellow over time. The plastic coating over the top will yellow. So the best way to avoid having one of your lights or two of your lights start to put out a different color of light is to buy them all at the same time. At a minimum, you need to use the same brand and the same model of lights, because there is such a variation in the quality from brand to brand and even from model to model. The more you mix up your LEDs or the more you mix up your flashes, the more trouble you may get into down the road. One other reason to buy same brand, same model is that the light spectra that these things give off can be quite different, very different even. So you definitely want to have a matched light spectrum. Even if there are wavelengths missing from the LEDs, all the LEDs are missing the same wavelengths. So you don't get weird shifting colors as you go from one part of your subject to another, because there are two different lights on it. One thing you've probably noticed about LED light bulbs, if you have any in your house, is that they don't dim using regular dimming circuits. And dimmers for LEDs are quite expensive. So if you are going to use LEDs and you think you're going to use them primarily, you really, really need a way to dim them. Otherwise, they're continuous lighting. And as you know from any photography that you do, you don't want to be using two light sources as a key light and a fill light if they're both the same intensity. Then it's just two lights. So having a light that you can use at a lower or a higher intensity is really, really important. And getting that in an LED is expensive. That's one of the features that a light like this has. It has multiple different brightness intensities. So what about flash? Flash is my go-to studio light source for macro photography. There are three principal reasons that I choose flash over continuous lighting most of the time when the subject permits. The first is that they're fast, with flash durations down to 1/20,000th of a second. The second is I have an enormous range of powers that I can use, all the way from full power down to 1/128th and even lower than that. The third reason is the color rendition is perfect. Good flash units put out daylight, and you can rely on it. Even the less expensive third-party flashes put out very believable daylight. They're easy to modify. They're easy to mount in a lighting cage. There are a lot of reasons to love flash. And of course, there is a huge range of flash available on the market. Now, I strongly recommend that if you're thinking about getting into flash, don't buy expensive Canon and Nikon flashes or any of the name brand ones. The reason is you're buying a lot of circuitry that is not going to really help in your macro photography. TTL is something you would never use. You don't want your flash changing the light intensity halfway through a stack that you're shooting. So it's very, very important that you have full control, and full control means you don't need all of that fancy circuitry. And Yongnuo and Godox put out really good speed lights. They're also TTL if you ever want to use them for that, but they're a fraction of the price. The model that I prefer is from Godox, the V860 Mark II for Nikon. Fantastic flash, never had a problem with them. Had a little bit of trouble with one of the earlier models. I had two of them go out at one time, but this flash has been fantastic, and it uses one of those big battery packs, and I've talked about that before. But remember, also with flash, try to buy exactly the same model, exactly the same everything, even the batch number if possible. You want a matched set. Now, the reasons are different than with LEDs. The reason you want a matched set is because different flashes will have different lag periods between triggering them and flash. And sometimes that can be a big enough difference that your flashes are going off at different times, or worse, they're going off at unpredictable times. So it's just safer to get the same brand, the same lights with a trigger made for those lights. You don't have to use a radio trigger. You can use light. You can use your camera flash to trigger your other flashes in slave mode. You know all of that. But there is a real value to making sure that you have the same brand and the same model. Even the same model from year to year may change in some of its characteristics. It might be that 1/64th power is a bit brighter in this year's model than it was in last year's model. So if you can, buy them together, buy them at the same time. Remember, when you buy your flashes, unlike the bendy arm lights that you just clip on your cage and go, you're going to need a way to attach your flashes. There are a million ways that you can do it. I use these 11-inch articulating arms with small rig super clamps on the end. I use these for everything. I have one that I wash my back with in the shower. I don't, I made that up because they would rust. And I don't shower. No, I do. And with that, let's wrap up chapter 2 of my best practices for macro lighting. Don't miss chapter 3, already available on YouTube. It's the final lighting for photography video. Turns out to be number 13, I think, in all, where we bring it all together in the macro cage. Thanks again for watching. See you soon. Goodbye.